being with us tonight. I think we were affected a little bit by the weather and the dampness outside, and also some spring fevers apparently set in, and sometimes that will affect our attendance. We're a few fewer than normal, but we do appreciate your attendance, and thank you for coming out on this wonderful night. Great little presentation here. I'm going to have some remarks before I introduce John Foreman as our first speaker. First of all, the big news in Millbrook, if you have not heard, and I can't imagine anybody hasn't heard, is that the Bennett property at the lower end of Franklin Avenue, where Mary and I live, as coincidentally, has been, and Nancy is there as well, has been purchased by the combination of the Thorn Property LLC, I think it's Thorndale LLC, and the Tribute Gardens. Essentially, it's the Thorn family in two different segments or two different purchases, but that purchase was consummated and, well, it was closed on Monday. It was announced Tuesday morning by press release. David Greenwood got an immediate phone call from the press. I got one, and it went downhill from there. In any case, it's probably one of the finest news that this village and town have received in a long, long while. It's been a long time coming. We are so grateful for it to happen. It's so nice that we have a local family and a local personality who leads that family today, who is the head of this purchase, and that is O.T., younger Oakley Thorne. And he is the one who is responsible for putting the beautiful building, and I will say beautiful. A lot of people have said, oh, it's too big. I'm saying, no, it's beautifully done. If you go down on Front Street, his new office building for Thorndale LLC is gorgeous. It's a beautiful color combination, very subtle. It's not small, but it fits in very nicely with the architecture, I think, of the village. Some people may agree, disagree, but that's what he does. We're delighted to have Thorndale and Tribute Gardens do this. The disposition of Bennett, for those who may not know, may occur in the following way. There's been talk about a small public park, which would be an extension, if you read the newspaper press release. It may be an extension of the Tribute Gardens Park we already have at the lower end of Franklin Avenue, our main street in Millbrook. The second element of the estate down there, or the property, which is 27.5 acres total. I believe about 1.5 acres was already owned by the Thorne family anyway, right across the street from their place, would be some sort of residential or housing. Reasonable, small, fits in with the scale of the village and would be beneficial to the population. The third it's been talked to, but there's nothing official. Maybe some sort of multi-use including possible business, maybe a complex or an office or something of that nature, but it would be very tastefully done if we know what the Thorns have done in the past. We've seen the evidence of what they've done down in Franklin, or down on Front Street, and we know their hearts and minds are with us here in the village of Millbrook, and we're delighted to be working with them. What will probably happen right now, as I understand it, is that if you read the press release again, the property will be, quote, studied, and then a plan for demolition or deconstruction of the buildings there, which are far beyond reclamation. They're gone, they're done, they were probably by 1990, almost done, and by 1995 they were beyond any sort of reclamation or saving. It's unfortunate, there's a wonderful history down there. Probably we will have more programs on it. We can probably anticipate a program on Bennett next year, I'm sure, as a result of this activity, but that will occur. What else to say? We're just very happy. David, go ahead.
Speaking as the town and village historian, it's interesting. For those of you who get the Gipsy Journal, I suspect you've seen this ad. Within an hour of it being delivered at the shop next to the post office, it was sold out. They're gone. So I recommend, if you do have this at home, clip it and save it, because this is such an important moment in history. All the details that are going to follow up are important, but this is the first official news of it, and this is the stuff of legacy. It really is part of our history and the tradition, so I encourage you, save it if you have it.
That's a good point. If you have copies,
And intended to.
if you do not intend to keep them or don't want to keep them and are willing to pass them on to the Historical Society, we can make them part of our archives, even if we have multiple copies. So I would solicit your good feelings about it and see whether you can do that. Okay, moving beyond Bennett, because we will see that unfold over the next several years. All right, the deconstruction will occur, then probably presentations to the local planning board, which I'm a member, will occur over the next months and years. So that will be, we're looking forward to exciting times for the village, and everything we know about what they've done and will do is right in line with what this village needs and wants. So we're very, very happy about it. Changing on to the next subject, just a quick report on our society here, our Historical Society, Town of Washington, Village of Millbrook. We're in good health. Our membership program is, we just did another scrubbing of membership tonight, and we've gotten the membership just about where we want it for right now, but we want to increase it, and there are plans for doing that. We have a wonderful set of programs. You're going to see an excellent program tonight. Interestingly, we have two outstanding speakers for you tonight. Our archives under Kathy Derringer, who's sitting in the back room over there, is moving right along. Kathy took over for Jenny Alderson this last year and is doing a marvelous job of shepherding our archives through the process, and it's wonderful. Our dues, thanks to your cooperation and help, are proceeding very nicely as well. We are solvent. We are in the black, and we don't need to go into all the details. Our annual tea, which we've been promising to tell you about, has finally been solidified. Saturday, June 14th. You can remember it as Flag Day. Right? Thorndale. Thorndale is going to be the location. Big house. Haley Thorne, proprietor of the and resident of the main house right now, is our host, and we will have an annual tea. It starts at 5 o'clock. We will have a program. David will be speaking on the history of the Thorndale estate and other ancillary items, I believe. And we may have another young lady by the name of Juanita Mendez with a story of a relative of hers from the Vietnam War era, which is very poignant and very, very important to us. So we're looking forward to the tea. The tea is for members or prospective members who are willing to make the commitment that day to join our society. Our society dues are very, very reasonable. 25 for a single, 30 for a family. And we're looking forward to a good program at Thorndale. Community Day, Saturday, September 6th. The first Saturday, traditionally following Labor Day. Labor Day is on a Monday this week, this year rather, this week. It's on a Monday. It's on a Monday, thanks, Labor Day. And so it's on Saturday the 6th. It's going to be up and down Franklin Avenue, probably expanding over onto the Village Green. This Historical Society plans to be involved to a level that we have not experienced before, and that means large and a lot of activities, an element of the oral history, an element of our local history. Come on. What are the other things? There are 6 things total. What's that? Ice cream. Yes. All right, fine. There are all sorts of things. We're going to have a static display. We're going to have oral history, archival. Oh my gracious, I'm sorry.
Museum
My
in the
mind is
Streets.
with it. What's that?
There's going to be a presentation of the upcoming Museum in the Streets.
Museum in the Streets will be there. We're asking the fire company to tie in because they've got a wonderful old fire engine they've restored up there. We asked them to join us in the effort. And yes, guess what? Charlie let the cat out of the bag. All comers to the Community Day event. We have 3 sponsors of the free ice cream that day. We have at least 1,000 servings of ice cream to give away.
1,000 servings.
1,000 servings. Plus a cookie to go in each one, Frank. Okay? And Stewart's Ice Cream has been extremely cooperative and very helpful in bringing this about. Moronis is cooperating with us and working with us very closely on this as well. We plan to get some local labor in the form of some of our students for the high school involved through Interact, we hopefully can do. And we have an anonymous backer, someone who wants to remain anonymous but is throwing some resources at the effort, and that's why the free ice cream is coming back. The Stewards is also cooperating very nicely. This will be the hook. I don't think anybody's gonna do it, other than us, and nobody's contacted stewards yet, so this will be one of the draws. But we're looking forward to a good event. Let's get into our program. We've talked enough here. Our first speaker is John Foreman. He's by the way, I've got a lot of notes here because the backgrounds on both John and Bill are extensive, and I could never remember all of them. But John is obviously a well-known personality and an historian himself. 2 years ago, he gave a beautiful talk and tour of Daheim, the Daheim house, the Timothy Leary house up there. He has rented, restored, and raised a family in the original Dietrich mansion on the Daheim estate. Is that the same house, John, it is, isn't it?
Yes, actually it's Daheim.
Daheim, I'm sorry, my apologies. I can always be corrected.
Means my
Right,
day,
Mary?
my day,
Right?
my home.
My home.
My home,
Yeah.
Daheim. Thank you very much for that clarification, John, that's good. Okay, he writes the, quote, Big Old Houses column for the New York Social Diary. He's the author of The Vanderbilts and the Gilded Age, Architectural Aspirations from 1879 to 1903. He has this marvelous old houses in Millbrook, which is available through our local bookstore, Merit Books. It's not an inexpensive item, but it is a treasured item. This is a wonderful history of local houses, and John's going to be focusing on one of them today. He's often quoted authority on New York social and architectural history. So I'll introduce Bill Schlesinger, our second speaker, when John is done. John, welcome. Please take over. Thank you.
I love that verb, deconstructed, as far as storm goes. It's so much more genteel than demolish. Anyway, I know it's risky to talk about a local person to a bunch of people from the same locality. However, Mrs. Flagler, actually not Mrs. Flagler, Mrs. Cary, I think we've all heard, everybody here has heard of her name, but I'd be surprised if you knew too much about her. And when I wrote the treasured book over there, I did discover quite a lot about her, and so I thought I'd share that with you tonight. I found it kind of interesting. And I thought I'd start out with the notice of her death, which was, she died on Christmas Day, 1967, which was a real long time ago, right? 1967, as some of you, like myself, may well remember, was the summer of love. And whereas everybody has heard of Mrs. Cary, anyway, in the New York Times of December 29th, it said, Mrs. Mary H.F. Cary, 66, not so old, dies. Mrs. Mary Harkness Flagler Cary, president of the National Orchestral Association at 111 West 57th Street, died yesterday in her apartment at 834 Fifth Avenue. Nice building, by the way. Mrs. Cary was the widow of Melbert Brinkerhoff Cary, former president of the Institute of Graphic Arts, who knew, and a granddaughter of Henry Morrison Flagler, a founder of the Standard Oil Company. This most of us sort of knew that Standard Oil was tied in with her. She was 66 years old. Her permanent residence was at Edgewood, an estate in Millbrook, New York. Mrs. Cary was elected president of the association shortly after its formation in 1930. It carried on the work of the dissolved American Orchestral Society, providing opportunities for musically promising students and functioning as a training orchestra. The association gets 4 concerts a year at Carnegie Hall and broadcasts weekly. Mrs. Cary was also president of the Scholarships Foundation, which helps students to complete their education. She was born in New York, a daughter of Harry Harkness Flagler and Mrs. Anne Lamont Flagler. Her father was a president of the Philharmonic Society of New York. Her husband had been the founder of the Press of the Woolly Whale, publishers at 415 Lexington Avenue. And well, so she was a philanthropist. She was tied in with music, and I frankly, I didn't know that at all. And I had only the vaguest sense of who Harry Harkness Flagler was, but he was not a man who worked. Anyway, 2 weeks after that article, the Times says, oil heiress leaves $50 million to state. The granddaughter of one of the founders of the Standard Oil Company has left the bulk of her estate, valued at $50 million, this is 1967 too, to the state of New York. The woman was Mrs. Melbert B. Cary, the former Mary Flagler, whose grandfather, Henry M. Flagler, joined with John D. Rockefeller, William Rockefeller, and 2 other men to incorporate the Standard Oil Company in Cleveland on January 10th, 1870. She died at the age of 66. Under the terms of her wills, And here, I wish I had a magnifying glass, probate in Poughkeepsie, a trust fund was established to be used by the state or any political subdivision for exclusively public purposes, or for any religious, scientific, charitable, or educational purposes. Joseph M. Murphy, the state's Commissioner of Taxation and Finance, said bequests of the type and magnitude of Mrs. Cary was highly unusual. And it was so unusual that it wasn't really true, but we'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, to go back to the beginning here, in April of 1900, which was the year before Mary Flagler was born, Joseph Tuckerman Tower of Poughkeepsie, and later of Meadowlark Lodge. Meadowlark Lodge was the Dutchess Day School, was the name of the Dutchess Day School in the towers on it. But before they had built that house, they sold Edgewood, which is illustrated right there, on a little over 200 acres to Anne Lamont Flagler. Annie Flagler's husband, Harry Harkness Flagler, 1870 to 1952, was the only son of a very rich and famous man, Henry Morrison Flagler, who lived between 1830 and 1913. He managed to co-found Standard Oil, open the entire state of Florida with a railroad. This is Mary Cary's grandfather, and revolutionized America's resort industry, all before falling down a flight of marble stairs in his Palm Beach palace and dying at the age of 84. Flagler's wife, Mary, and this is the sort of the skeleton in the closet of Flagler's. Flagler's wife, this is Henry Morrison Flagler, Mary's grandfather, she died in 1881, and after a respectable 2-year interval, he married her former nurse, a woman named Ida Alice Shorts, S-H-O-U-R-D-S. In 1893, he convinced his son Harry, Mary's father, then at college at Columbia University, to return to Florida and take charge of his now world-famous Flagler hotels. These were the Ponce de Leon in St. Petersburg, the Alcazar in St. Augustine, and the Royal Poinciana in West Palm Beach. I think they've all either been torn down or burned down at this point, but this guy really revolutionized the tourist industry in Florida. He built a railroad down there. In fact, the city of Miami wanted to rename itself Flagler after him, but he said that he felt that Miami was a more marketable name. Harry did. He went down to Florida to join his father. And the next year, he too was married to Anne Louise Lamont. Trouble, however, never strays far from the excessively fortunate. One evening in 1895, Harry and his father got into such a row that the son left town abruptly and barely spoke to his father again for the rest of his life. It has been suggested that in the 1897 institutionalization of Flagler's second wife, Ida, this was the nurse, was somehow connected to these events. Ida Flagler had the dubious distinction in 1901 of being the cause of a Florida law recognizing insanity as grounds for divorce. Before that year was out, her husband divorced her and married Mary Lily Kennan, considerably younger than he was. In 1902, he presented the new Mrs. Flagler with a marble palace in Palm Beach called Whitehall, which is still down there. It's open to the public now. I think it's designed by Cary and Hastings. It's quite a place in Palm Beach. This was the state of Harry's family, and Harry being, again, Mary's father, when he and his wife bought Edgewood. Temperamentally, father and son had never had much in common. The father was a swashbuckler, a builder of empires. The son, Harry, was prim and fastidious, a lover of art. Throughout his life, Harry Flagler never lacked for money. Likely he's not had his own trust. But it is of note that when his father died in 1913, the bulk of his $60 million estate went to his son anyway, whom he had rarely seen for almost 20 years. $60 million in 1913, a significant period. Given the Flagler family's century-old roots in Dutchess County, this I hadn't realized. The Flaglers were here for hundreds of years, and they went off and they went off, and then Harry came back here. His move to Millbrook may have represented a sort of symbolic return to uncorrupted values. Uncorrupted maybe, simpler hardly. Edgewood started out as a nice place, but it became a show place, notable as much for formality as scale. In 1903, James E. Ware doubled the size of the Flagler's new house. Actually, it started out with just this. this part. And then James E. Ware, who's done a real lot of stuff. James E. Ware was, of course, the architect of the soon-to-be deconstructed hotel, and also my house, and also of the original Altamont. And Ware did really a tremendous amount of work here. Meanwhile, Harry joined the Millbrook Hunt, which was just beginning then. And back then they hunted almost anything, not just foxes. The lawn terrace behind his Millbrook mansion became a hunt fixture. The Flaglers had 3 children, Mary first, then Elizabeth, and finally Jean. In summer, the family busied itself beautifying Edgewood, entertaining house guests, and sponsoring worthy causes in the village. Harry's charities included the local choral society, something called the Boys Vacation Reading Club, and the Millbrook Free Library, whose operating expenses he personally underwrote. Harry Harkness Flagler was also among the founders of the Millbrook School for Boys, now the Millbrook School. And he's, of course, the chapel there is the Flagler Chapel, as it was originally called. During the winter, the Flagler were Murray Hill people with a house at 32 Park Avenue between 35th and 36th Street, which is now an apartment house, but it lasted until the 1930s, I think. According to his New York Times obituary many years later, Harry Flagler, quote, never engaged in business, close quote, and, quote, kept aloof from the affairs of the Standard Oil Company. He may have been no businessman, but he did have a consuming interest in the world of classical music. He was the vice president of the Symphony Society of New York, which in 1928 merged with the Philharmonic Society, and he became the first president of the New York Philharmonic. So he was very active in music in the city. Nor were his efforts limited to America. In 1923, in appreciation of his war-era support of the Fontainebleau School of Music, the French government awarded him the Cross of the Legion of Honor. In June of 1927, so he had 3 daughters, right? And in June of 1927, the Flagler's second daughter, Elizabeth, married J. Andrew Harris III. And for the wedding, Harry chartered a special 15-car train to transport guests from Grand Central to Millbrook. I'd love to go to a wedding like this. For the reception, he had a large wooden pavilion constructed on a lawn just inside the main gate to Edgewood. The main gate to Edgewood, of course, is right across the street from the Golf and Tennis Club. And the Golf and Tennis Club is indeed this pavilion that was built for... After the event, the Flagler-Harris wedding pavilion was disassembled, hauled off the property, and reincarnated on the opposite side of the Dutchess Turnpike as the clubhouse for the Millbrook Golf and Tennis Club, where it remains today. However, 4 years before the famous Harris wedding, and amidst much less pomp, Harry's eldest daughter, Mary, had married Melbert Brinkerhoff Cary, Mike to his friends and family. He was the 30-year-old son of a former chairman of the Connecticut State Democratic Party. Mike Cary had all the right credentials for this sort of marriage. He attended Groton and Yale, he joined the University Club, he served in the First War. However, instead of heading to Wall Street, he made a left turn and became a graphic artist, which was an unusual thing. He was a quiet, scholarly sort, who would eventually found a small publishing house called the Press of the Lord. I don't know where he got that. Its stock and trade consisted of books he thought were interesting, even if nobody else did. Woolley Wales' most remembered opus was probably something called The Devil's Bible, a deck of playing cards whose kings, queens, and jacks bore caricatures of World War I politicos. Mary Cary had almost none of her sister Elizabeth's social savvy, and absolutely none of her sister Jean's vivaciousness, but she had something neither one of them ever had, namely a loving and lasting relationship with one man. Divorce plagued the Flagler girls. Most people lost count of Jean's husband. By contrast, Mike and Mary Cary were inseparable. Mary Cary had grown up spending about half of every year, May to September, with her family in Millbrook. In the formal world of Edgewood, children shook hands with their parents, footmen stood in the dining room at mealtime, elaborate dinners and big house parties were the norm. Mike Cary took to this world happily, with the result that the couple became regular fixtures in her parents' house. Indeed, they practically lived with her parents. And just before her sister's marriage, this house was practically doubled in size. They built a wing that like goes all the way out there, and it was there until the house was pulled down in '67, but it was or a little after that. But the house was absolutely enormous in the 20s, the 20s. Anyway, during their second married summer, this would be 1925, the Carys began to look for land of their own in Millbrook. Their first purchase, made in 1925 for $5,000, was the 175-acre Pettit Farm, located west of the village in the Canoe Hills. The Canoe Hills used to be spelled, in fact it still is, C-A-N-O-E, like the canoe. Among its many advantages was a hillside with direct sight lines to Edgewood. Such was the start of the Canoe Hill Estate, and Mary and Mike changed the spelling to C-A-N-N-O-O. It was it was picturesque, but that was made up. That wasn't a real historical, that they made that up. The picturesquely fractured spelling being Cary's idea. In 1927, the year of Sister Elizabeth's mega wedding to John Harris, Mike and Mary bought the 155-acre Henry Farm. Canoe Hills grew inexorably over the next 12 years until it engulfed a total of 14 farms and covered almost 2,000 acres. One of the ways Mike and Mary managed to accumulate farmland was to rent it back to its former owners, usually at rock-bottom rates, like $8 to $10 a month. Most of the local agriculturalists were rural Yankee types. Farmer Pettit, for example, had probably never seen $1,000 in one place in his life, let alone $5,000 in his bank account after selling the family farm. What he and the other new tenants didn't anticipate was the Cary's hands-off management style, as far as the new owners were concerned. Tenants who paid $8 a month could make their own repairs. For a period of time, Canoe Hills was a sort of schizophrenic estate. It was half farming community and half estate. But inevitably, the farmers left the land, often because their farm buildings were falling down, and one by one, their open fields reverted to forest. To be fair, the Carys didn't want to be farm landlords, they wanted to develop a country estate. One wonders why, in 16 years of ownership, they never built a house. In the early 1930s, they did build a 2-room cabin on one of their Canoe Hills and called it the Tea House. Few visitors ever penetrated this inner sanctum, which was a sort of a grown-up playhouse. They hid out here for hours, sometimes days, savoring picnics prepared by the cook at Edgewood, or maybe scrambling up an egg or two. They read, they gazed at the Catskills in one direction, at Edgewood in the other. Mike chopped wood, and together they planned the house they would never build. The Great Depression did not have a great effect on the Flaggers. During its darkest years, Cary was donating $50,000 to Harvard for a poetry room. He was still supporting the Fontainebleau School in France. He served as patron and president of the Millbrook School for Boys, and according to the press of the day, he single-handedly underwrote the New York Philharmonic. Harry Flagler and Edgewood were part of Millbrook's iconography. He was a hilltopper, like Mr. Thorne at Thorndale, or Mrs. Standish at Breeze Hill, Miss Lamont in Altamont, Mrs. Miller at Carodic, which is actually the way it's properly pronounced, even though it sounds like, I always thought it was Caradoc, but I'm told by family members that it was properly pronounced Carodic. It comes from a legend, it's a Morse letters. These people and their houses all spoke to an enduring social order that had been a part of Millbrook since its beginning. The Flaglers and the Carys were unburdened by money worries, but a dark cloud hung over Mike and Mary's romantic idol. Mike Cary suffered from bone cancer, whose grim process led in 1941 to the amputation of his left leg. The operation performed in New York was a success. Mary visited him at the hospital on the evening of the surgery, and they joked about how he was going to get around without tipping over. She left him in good spirits and was horrified to learn the next morning that he had died in the night from an embolism. He was 49 years old. As a girl, Mary Flagler had been shy. As a wife, becomingly modest. As a widow, pretty much undone. Her husband was her life, and after his death, her few friends would remember her as having a sort of Weltschmerz, an air of permanent sadness. She moved in with her father, alone since the death of his wife in 1939, and led a privileged but solitary life, sharing the vast house in the country and the big apartment in town, with an ailing parent, attending the occasional tea with a country neighbor, supporting musical charities in New York. It was whispered in Millbrook that she laid out her dead husband's clothes every morning. Strangers assumed she was severe, or at least aloof. In July 1952, while in town for a doctor's visit, Harry Harkness Flagler, her father, died of a heart attack. He was 81 years old. Mary's first reaction was to abandon Edgewood and rent a suite of rooms at the Cottonwood Inn, now the Millbrook Training Center, you know. Soon enough, she was back at Edgewood, however, infused with a strange new determination. Mary Cary had found a focus in her life: trees. In the quarter century since she and her husband had started buying farmland in the Canoe Hills, rebounding nature had converted their former fields into woodlands. Mary and her husband had watched the process benignly at first. In the years following his death, she became fascinated, some might say obsessed, with what could only be called decorating the Canoe Hills. She became a local Davy Tree Service's best customer. By the late 1950s, she had them regularly moving full-grown specimens, transplanting entire groves, rearranging woods to open view lines, and everywhere pruning. In 1985, a woman named Elise Broach, working at the time for the Institute of Ecosystem Studies, conducted a series of interviews with 16 people who had known Mary Cary. The result was a charming, if you overlooked the Welschmidt's, monograph titled "A Woman at the Edge of the Wood." The title sounds like a medieval myth, a tale of gloomy forests and an enchanted princess, and truth be told, that's not far off the mark. The portrait that emerges of Mary Cary is of a plump, homely, standoffish woman with few social graces and fewer friends. The sort of person who'd snap at you one day, agonize alone over it afterwards, and apologize to you 2 days later. She could be tyrannical with employees one moment, self-effacing the next, sit motionless for hours gazing into one of her forests, and set off in a fury after a trespasser. Mrs. Broach described her as an exterior decorator, with 2,000 acres of low hills to work on. As the years passed, she gained momentum, persistently repositioning trees and rearranging entire woods. She and John Boughton from Davie used to drive around Dutchess County in her old Packard, actually shopping for trees. If she spotted one she liked, she'd have Boughton knock on her front door and offer the owner $100. People may have thought she was nuts, but were usually happy to take the money. A day or two later, a 7-man crew from the Navy Tree Service would arrive to trench, ball, and wrap. In the frozen months, this might take a full week. The root ball might measure 14 feet across. And as a matter of fact, it's a little hard to tell, but that's Mary Cary, and that tree in the middle of it is a full-grown tree that she's just had Davy take from some farmers around here and move over to her estate in Edgewood. Or maybe that's the Canoe Hills, I don't know. Mrs. Cary's tree fetish was a source of amusement and perplexity in Millbrook, but she was accepted as a harmless eccentric. One thing she was not, however, was a trained ecologist. She was a rich woman playing with trees. She coddled them in lieu of children, grooming and beautifying the big ones, shaking snow off the tender little ones. Ms. Broach describes a poignant scene in 1963 when Mary discovered the Department of Transportation widening Route 40, the old 44A, and cutting down 70 trees in the prospect. Horrified at the carnage, she managed to pull enough strings in Albany to force work to stop. After a heated confrontation with John Foreman, held amidst a tangle of felled trunks and shattered limbs, he stormed away and left her standing by herself. A moment later, she burst into uncontrollable sobs, and no one present had the courage to comfort her. Mary Cary managed small armies of pruners, planters, and sprayers to care for her trees. But when it came to buildings, those of her tenants in Edgewood alike, she was remarkably indifferent. John Boughton marveled at the collapsing ceilings at Edgewood, where, in lieu of repairs, foam plaster was simply swept up. Besides having bad luck with men, the Flagler girls were not long-lived. Mary's sister, Elizabeth, died in Chestnut Hill, Pennsylvania in 1966. She was 58 years old. Jean made it to 68, dying on a Hawaiian vacation in 1979. Mary herself passed away at age 66 on Christmas Day, 1967. We've heard stories of rich people leaving money to cats and dogs and even birds, but it's hard to recall an instance of a woman leaving a fortune to her trees. That, however, was one of the principal intentions of Mary Cary's will. She explicitly forbade the sale or subdivision of Canoe Hills. Her executors were instructed to transfer intact within 15 years, either to the Village of Millbrook, the State of New York, or, quote, any charitable organization actively engaged in conservation, maintenance, and preservation of natural resources. After striking out with the Nature Conservancy, the Audubon Society, the executors succeeded in giving it to the New York Botanical Garden. The Botanical Garden named it the Cary Arboretum, the term defined by Webster's as a, quote, plot of land on which many different trees are grown for study or display, close quote. It would be some years before the focus on ecosystem studies redefined the former Arboretum. Mary's will left Edgewood to her sister Elizabeth, or, if she were already dead, which she was, to whichever of her two sons wanted it. In August of 1968, title to Edgewood passed to Henry Flagler Harris, Nick to his friends. This was Jean's son. Married 3 years earlier to a Bennett College girl named Audrey Parsons. The estate came with a $500,000 trust. This is in 1968, it's a lot of money. from which, the income from which would accrue to whomever, quote, kept the place together. To be the recipient of a great big old house, be it a little run down or not, on a 200-acre Dutchess County estate, no matter if a bit overgrown, with a $500,000 operating trust, worth 10 times that in today's dollar, would, for some of us, be better than seeing Naples. But in 1968, nobody wanted white elephants, least of all Edgewood's heir and his young wife. Absent selling or donating to the church, demolition or deconstruction, as we now say, was the alternative of the day. After a period of being picked over by antiquarians and book and manuscript dealers, Edgewood was bulldozed in the early 1970s. Anyway, to return to that $50 million that was supposedly given to the state, a year later, in the New York Times, January 15th, 1968, the New York Times says, Cary, the title of the headline is, Cary Estate Aid says state bequest is, quote, only potential. The article says, the state of New York is a potential rather than absolute beneficiary of the $50 million trust fund established by the late Mrs. Melvin B. Cary, according to Herbert J. Jacoby, one of the executives of her will. A story in the New York Times yesterday said the bulk of the estate was going to New York State. The state, he said today, is simply one of a potential group of beneficiaries. Speaking of the trustees, Mr. Jacoby said they may distribute to any people normally regarded as charitable beneficiaries for tax purposes. The state of New York, cities, towns, and villages. This category, he pointed out, would also include private charitable organizations, among them those of a religious, scientific, or educational. There is no obligation on the part of the trustees to give anything to the state of New York, Mr. Jacoby said. He said the state would play no role in the administration of the trust. And anyway, in a 1975 follow-up on the news from October 1975, the New York Times, under the subheading Millions for Charity, the front page headlines on January 14th, 1968 said, oil heiress leaves $50 million to state. But the next day, the executor of the will announced that the state is simply one of a potential group of beneficiaries. The deceased heiress was married to Michael Cary, whose grandfather, Henry N. Flagler, joined with Rockefeller in 1870 to found the Standard Oil Company. How much of the legacy did the state finally get? Quote, the state of New York has not received anything except taxes, says Herbert J. Jacoby, the Manhattan lawyer, one of the trustees. Of course, that the money, which came to a total of over $50 million, has gone into the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust of Millbrook, New York. And each year the trust has been dispensing the earnings to charities. So the state didn't get anything. But if the state didn't get anything from many other people got a lot from the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust. And the newspapers are full of notes in it. For example, in 1969, Columbia acquires a copy of Rare Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation from a copy of the Gutenberg Bible has been acquired by the Columbia University Library as a gift of the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust. It was 1971. Gift of townhouse to city stirs fight. 152 East 65th Street, a house which still stands. If any of you know what the Joneswood Association is, but there's a complex of houses between 66 and 65th that are all with a central garden. It's not well known, but this is right across the street from Joneswood. Says the house was acquired in 1927 by Mrs. Cary's husband, the late Melvin Cary, an expert in the graphic arts who headed the press of a woolly whale, which printed rare editions by hand press, according to Herbert J. Jacoby, a lawyer and a trustee of Mrs. Cary's estate. Mr. Cary bought the property from a cousin, whom he permitted to live in the townhouse until his death in 1941. The Carys had planned to rehabilitate the house, but never got around to it. This seems to be a pattern with it. And in 1971, also, the Botanical Garden. The Botanical Garden, in the New York Times, says the headline, Botanical Garden plans to Center for Forest and Garden Study. It will be set up on an estate of 1,800 acres and endowed by a trust. The nation's largest garden research center, including the first arboretum to be developed by professional botanical staff, will be set up by the New York Botanical Garden in Millbrook, Dutchess County. The center is to be an estate of nearly 1,800 acres, Canoe Hills, left by the late Mrs. Melbert B. Cary, Standard Oil heiress to the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust. Mrs. Cary was the granddaughter of Henry and Flagler, blah, 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 so on and so forth. So that's 1971. But her bequest after the Arboretum was mostly, she was constantly focused on here's one in 1982. The Pierpont Morgan Library will receive a $1.1 million from the trustees of the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust for the endowment of the Mary Flagler Cary Music Collection. The grant will be given in installments over the next 5 years. In 1983, the Morgan Library buys 19 rare music manuscripts. The library, which already owns one of the most important collections of music manuscripts in the world, has just purchased 19 items from the collector Robert O. Lehman for an undisclosed price. The purchase includes manuscripts ranging from Haydn to Arnold Schoenberg to Albert Berg. There's also an incomplete manuscript of Stravinsky's Persephone. I don't know, I didn't really follow this news at the time. It says funds to pay for the 19 items came from the Mary Flagler Cary Trust. Mrs. Cary, who gave the Morgan Library her important collection of music manuscripts before her death, set up a trust fund for the purpose of expanding her collection. Thus, the manuscripts sold by Mr. Lehman will now become a part of the Cary collection. In 1984, here's the trust endowing the National Orchestral Association, which has been training young musicians since 1930 years. No tuitions or fees will be charged for participation in the program. The association will award fellowships funded by the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust. Here's one from the year 2000. Herbert Cahoon, age 82, curator of the Morgan Library, has died at the age of 82. Under Mr. Cahoon, major acquisitions included the Mary Flagler Cary Music Collection in 1968. The collection, which Mr. Cahoon said had been hidden away in Mrs. Cary's Fifth Avenue apartment for years, included original copies of Brahms' First Symphony and Beethoven's Ghost Trio, among other renowned works by the likes of Mozart, Schubert, Bach, and Verdi. Of note, I noticed of Mr. Cahoon, a footnote, Mr. Cahoon was known for unearthing interesting, obscure tidbits from the world of old letters. While organizing a show on Michelangelo in 1970, he detailed several menus of fish, pasta, and soup that refuted the accepted idea that Michelangelo had subsisted on bread and wine alone. Anyway, after Nick Harris gave Edgewood to the Milberg School for Boys. And the Milberg School for Boys, this is after the house was torn down, and the Milberg School for Boys, they then sold it. The reason he gave it to them was so that they could sell it to get the money for it. And the Milberg Roundtable on December 12, 1979 had a headline, Edgewood sold to developer for horse farm. It's unclear where the horse farm idea came from, since the first thing that the purchaser, a man named Edward Creary, did was to subdivide the property into 5 and later 7 large lots. 2 buyers subsequently purchased virtually all of Edgewood. Since 1981, the eastern half of the estate, containing the mansion site, a walled garden, which is a ruin of surpassing charm, and the original garage, which contains a mantel from the Holocene Hall, and the original superintendent's cottage has been served by one owner. The western half was purchased in 1984 by the son of Newport Society sportsman named J. Gordon Douglas. Douglas built a French provincial house with a Catskill view on the site of the former estate kennels. It was sold to the present owner in 1987. So Edgewood, the estate is still together. It's just been divided about equally in half. Travelers along today's Route 343 inevitably admire Edgewood's handsome stone walls, which is really a tribute to the Rotundos, who built it. It's a really beautiful piece of work. It's something when you drive by, notice the coping on the top of that wall, how beautifully it's done. It's easy to imagine the Flagler place on a hillside somewhere deep in the estate. Did I say Rotundo when I meant Cary? It's easy to imagine the Flagler place on a hillside somewhere deep in the estate, still lording it over Millbrook. However, there's nothing there anymore, nothing but a grassy knoll. But what is still there is the Mary Flagler Charitable Trust, which at the moment, according to Bloomberg Businessweek of 2 days ago, now has $138 million in assets. It focuses on music and conservation.
Thanks, Charlie.
If you have any questions, I'll try to listen. I gotta tell you though, I now write for the New York Social Letter, which I'm sure all of you rush to every morning to see the pictures. And I write about a big old house every week, and my mind is so full of it that I might have lost a couple of details. But if you have questions, I'll try not to confuse the tunnels with the Ferris. Yes?
Do you know why the flaggers came up, why they came up in the first place? I mean, how they happened to,
Yes, they were from here.
what's that?
They were from here. The flaggers were here long before Henry Morrison Flagler went to the Midwest to make his fortune. They had been here for 100 years. They were here in the 18th century. Yes.
There's a horse barn up above the Eagle Monument, right off Old County Route 9, or Old County Road, going out to the infirmary. Was that part of the Flagler estate? It's still an existing barn up
That was part of Bennett.
It's part of the Bennett?
That was Bennett's riding stables.
Ah, okay. Okay, fine, I was wrong.
But I think, I was interested to know that Joseph Tuckerman's tower was owned the edge of he sold it to Flagler, and the towers were here, and they built the Dutchess Day School, which is really nice house.
John Tompkins on the side, yeah.
Yes.
Of those two pictures, I assume the one on the left is also?
The one on the left is, the guy on the left is Harry Harkness Flagler. And this is when he's, this is a scene, a vignette from his years as president of the New York, Philharmonic. And
So
he's
that's
presenting.
that's not Mrs. Cary?
No, that's not Mrs. Cary. This is Mrs. Cary, although you probably can't see much of it, but that's her in the right-hand corner.
And is the man with her, her husband, or is that?
No,
that's
he's someone,
his dad?
he's someone who was working for her, and I forgot who he is.
Probably Davies.
And I love that someone so handsomely wrote underneath the picture and then forgot the L in Flagler.
Yeah. It's from my home postcard. Well, then I better turn over the floor to Councilor Schlesinger.
Thank you,
Thank
John.
you.
Great, thank you very much, John, for being with us. Thank you. All right, our second speaker for tonight, Bill Schlesinger. Dartmouth College grad, Cornell University PhD, 1976. Go on the internet and just read his biography. It goes on and on. It's very impressive, and I mean that in a very, very positive state. He's an expert in global change ecology, climate change, and decertification with an S. You might want to explain what that is, but he's the author of over 200 scientific publications. That is a major accomplishment. Not to the fact that he's also the author of a book on biogeochemistry that he used in colleges right now, very popularly and very spread throughout the United States in our college and university system. So Bill is a very well-published individual. He's a local resident with his wife Lisa. I live right here in the village. Unfortunately for us, we're going to be losing Bill and Lisa very shortly because he is retiring from Cary IES. His successor, Dr. Joshua Ginsberg, has been appointed. And in a way, this is, I won't call it a swan song, Bill, but I was going to say, this may be one of the last presentations you'll be making, despite your claim on the paper that the Cary one over there on your Four Horsemen subject was the last. Fascinating presentation that he made 2 weeks ago, the Four Horsemen, and what are the four major threats to our world as far as ecology and science go. As I say, he's a local resident with his wife Lisa, but Mary and I, my wife, know Bill in 3 different contexts, and we love him in all of them. One, he has a wonderful weekly program, which apparently is a logistical challenge, believe it or not. It's a 2-minute program. It's done at least once a week, I believe.
Daily.
It's on
Every day.
Daily,
What's that?
Stan,
I'm sorry,
daily.
I'm sorry, I stand corrected, thank you very much. On National Public Radio, published through WAMC and broadcast nationally through their various networks. It's only 2 minutes, but it's fascinating. It's full of fact, very interesting information. It's all scientific and it relates to life on our planet from a scientific point of view. He's also brought a tremendous amount of lectures to Cary IES, lectures on ecology, the environment. One very interesting series on fracking, and fracking in New York State, a very controversial term or subject that we're going through right now. Mary and I also know Bill in another context, and that is we take walks at the Cary Arboretum frequently, and it's a wonderful 3.1 mile track around the lower area right behind the State Troopers Barracks on Cary. And frequently we'd run into Bill there as he is bird watching. And so we know him from that, and we've had many lovely chats with him in the field. So we're going to miss you, Bill. You've been a wonderful member and contributor to our community. Please take this chair.
So it's incredibly presumptuous for me to speak to the Historical Society here, because one thing I learned about when you arrive at Millbrook, if you haven't been here for several generations, you're always going to be a person from away. And I'm now just a few days from 7 years here, and we've had a great time, and it's gone very fast, but I certainly, you know, when I look at the collective wisdom of history here in the room, what I know about the Cary Arboretum and such kind of pales in comparison to the collective stories you guys can put together. So we, Lisa and I arrived here 7 years ago. I'm the second president of the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. The first president was Gene Likens, who was brought here in the early 1980s by a set of trustees that, well, I think in all honesty, had probably gotten a little frustrated and maybe disconcerted about what was going on with the New York Botanical Gardens management of this arboretum. You know, not that it was bad, but it needed something. There was a lot of money, and it needed something to be special. And so they identified Gene Likens, who was a full professor at Cornell, to come here and establish the Institute of Ecosystem Studies. I've often needled Gene a little bit because when I went to Dartmouth in 1968, Gene was a young professor there. And after my freshman year, he moved to Cornell and went up through the ranks there and became a chaired professor in 1972. I had graduated from Dartmouth and went to Cornell. And so I was a graduate student in his department. And then we took about a 30-year split. I was down at Duke University doing my thing as on the faculty. And all of a sudden, Gene decided to retire in 2006 here. And Ned Ames, who some of you may know, who was the chief trustee of the Mary Flagler Cary Charitable Trust, was pretty influential in convincing me that this might be an interesting job, you know, leave a tenured position at Duke, come up to New York. Everybody else moved south, we moved north. And so it came to pass that once again, Gene found me in his life, almost as if I'd been stalking him for all these years. And Lisa and I got here in 07. It's worth talking a little bit about the history of the Arboretum and the Institute of Ecosystem Studies. The Arboretum was really set up when the New York Botanical Garden took over the management of the lands in about 1973. And they ran it through the 1970s. It was very much as outlined here, a time when the legacy of Mrs. Cary's Arboretum, her trees, her interest in trees, exotic trees, was of interest to the garden, and they maintained that through the 1970s. In 1983, when Gene arrived, he really wanted to set up a scientific institution and did a remarkable job. I have to admit, 25 years later when I arrived, the staff, both scientific and support staff, was absolutely spectacular to have in place at the time. But Gene built an organization that many of the people are still with us today, that has had incredible influence on the science of ecology in the U.S. And Gene himself, I think arguably was the discoverer of acid rain in North America. He became a member of the National Academy of Science and got the Presidential Medal from none other than George Bush. I needled him about that because I'm not sure Bush was ever terribly concerned about acid rain, but Gene, there's a picture of him getting, the medal draped around him. Just was and still is, he still is living in this area, a real luminary in ecology. And built a wonderful staff who worked in the Hudson River, who worked in the forests of this area, and more recently worked on disease ecology. All the time, we maintained the 2,000 acres that Mrs. Cary had left behind, partly as an area of research sites, but partly as a place where we could have people visit and understand the process of succession, which is kind of the orderly replacement. If you abandon a farm field and it gets colonized by trees and eventually grows back to a forest, that's all very predictable and understood by scientific principles. So Gene was very interested in managing that. When I arrived in 07, as I said, I inherited this wonderful staff of folks that had done well for 25 years. We were running a rather sizable deficit at the time that the trustees of the Institute were unhappy with, and the trustees of the Mary Flagler Cary Trust down in New York were also unhappy with. And so I was kind of brought in here and said, clean this place up a little bit, or at least balance the budget. And I know some of you probably remember, I'm the guy that did it. I closed the greenhouses and I closed the garden. And I insisted if we close the garden, we ought to close it so that it isn't visible where somebody says, well, it's just closed temporarily. It'll open again next year. So we closed it. Well, it was thoroughly closed. We used that as a way of bringing the Institute back into a balanced budget and really to focus what we were doing on the scientific aspects of the program. At the same time, and as Sten mentioned, I was very interested from my years at Duke at involving the public in understanding of science and understand what we were doing at the Institute, why that was important to the scientific process for issues like acid rain, global warming. And so we started a bunch of different programs, the Friday night program that I think some of you have come to periodically, Friday night lecture series, it's about once a month. We've had authors, we've had films, we've had our scientists, we've had other scientists, and it's really been a fun and delightful display of people over the last 6 years, essentially. I started the WAMC radio program. My director of communications pointed out today that we've done this for 2.5 years. Every day, every weekday, new segment, 2 minutes. That's a little more than 650 segments that are running out now until I retire, which is more than 20 hours of listening. And I said, Lori, this is not going to be a bestseller. Don't put that on a disc. But it's been a great deal of fun. It comes out of Albany and goes up and down the valley and east and west to Utica and Springfield. And it's been a time where in 2-minute segments I can cover an issue such as the Gulf oil spill or rising sea level on Long Island Sound, or acid rain in the Hudson Valley, or Lyme disease in your backyard. And we've ranged all over those. If you haven't caught it yet, 11:10 and 4:04. I come on there. And it's been, that's been a lot of fun, and it's an example of what I hope will be a continuing program at Cary to make sure that we can communicate the science to the public. So we got out of the garden business and the greenhouse business.
It's 90.9 on the FM.
There you are. Those were hideously expensive. It cost us more than $100,000 a year just for heat in the greenhouse. And we had 3 or 4 visitors, at best a month. And so just, there was a lot of people who were sad to see that go, but I think it was really essential to be able to do what we have been able to do, and to move forth. As Dan said, I work on response of forests and deserts to rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and climate change. I've done that both while I was a faculty member at Duke and have continued to do that up here. I regard that as one of the big issues of our future here. What will our species do in the face of, for the first time, really having achieved a population on the Earth that's beginning to affect globally the environment that we live in and that feeds us and that supplies fresh water. And we really don't know about what that future will bring, but we do know that the change is ongoing. It's measurable, and it's significant. It's outside of the variation of the past, and is something that's pretty alarming to a lot of us that work on that. So again, I hope that legacy will continue on into the future at Cary. Let's see, where am I? Let me say a little bit about Josh, and then I'll tell you what I'm going to be up to. Josh Ginsberg was selected by the trustees through a national search and announced just a couple of weeks ago here. He comes from the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is part of the Bronx Zoo, where he is director of science programs there. And he stems from doctoral work at Princeton a number of years ago, where he worked with Dan Rubenstein, who's very well known for studies of large African animals, lions and wild dogs and zebras and the like. Kind of different for me. I'm a chemist, and I mostly work on things you can't see. He works on big animals with teeth and fur, and things that people identify with. Josh has been with Wildlife Conservation Society quite a number of years, and I think will be a delightful addition to this community. He's very articulate, outgoing, and he just seems to love the fact that he's been selected to represent this place moving forward. And Chris has the fullest respect for the people like Gene Likens that have been there before, and the scientific staff that is moving on into the future. So I have pretty much the feeling that if he doesn't settle in Millbrook, he's going to settle near Millbrook. So I tried to sell him our house the other day. I don't know if that will happen. So I think, I guess my message there is that I think you're in good hands. I think he's a good guy. I think he will, he lives over in Woodstock now, and has a real love of the Hudson Valley and Hudson River, and the kinds of environmental problems with encroaching development and population growth here that concern us all. So what are Lisa and I doing? A number of years ago, well, we started bird watching probably 15 years ago. Lisa comes out of a humanities background, was an English major at James Madison, and we met down at Duke. And I don't know exactly what we found in common, but at some point, Duke asked me if I would lead at one of these alumni cruises to Antarctica, where you pay lots of money and go on a 2-week cruise with a faculty member lecturing to you. And so they asked me to do the lectures, and I went on and said, Lisa, do you want to come along? And she said, sure, it's Antarctica, it's my last continent. And so she came along. She'd never looked at a bird before, but on that trip, I think she really became a bird watcher. This was in 2000, and I'd been bird watching for a number of years. So we developed a real bond on that, started going up to Maine quite frequently. And I have a sister that lives in Mount Desert, and Lisa had a sister up in Stance that lived in Bangor. And as a result, we wanted to go somewhere else in Maine. So we passed through it and do the family visit, and then we moved on to Quebec, which is in very eastern Maine. It's over by Eastport and Calais, and basically fell in love with the little fishing village, which is by all accounts fallen on hard times there. Overfished the cod, overfished the herring, overfished the sardines. It's an example of how you can screw up a community and the economics by a lack of sustainability. But we fell in love with it for its birds and its kind of rural, rundown charm, for lack of a better term, and bought 45 acres of land on Cobscook Bay. Actually, I like to joke about that too. We closed on that the Monday of the stock market collapse. And, I guess it was. Kind of went up there, and now we got our own land where we could watch birds. A few years later, we decided, well, gee, this might be an interesting place to put up a little house. So we are just finishing a small, thoroughly green, constructed residence that will be in for the summer months. And then we've got a condominium down in North Carolina, right outside Duke, for hanging out in December, January, February, March, when Maine really is not inhabitable by normal people. So that's our plan, is to kind of be snowbirds from Maine to North Carolina. I'm on a bunch of national boards of environmental organizations, so I describe it as a future B&B, which is bird watching and board meetings. And I have a bunch of writing that, so when I was at Duke, I was, the last few years, I was the dean of the School of the Environment down there, and between that and being president here, a whole lot of professional activities got put on hold, particularly writing. And so I'm looking forward to being able to do that. So that's kind of a brief history of where we're going. And Cary, I thoroughly expect, well, actually, let me give you a few basic statistics of what we're all about. We're still 2,000 acres. We've sold a few pieces. We've bought a few pieces. I had a policy, and I hope Josh believes in it as well, of trying to shape up our perimeter and get rid of outliers and fill in holdings and make our property a coherent whole. And so we stayed right about 2,000 acres. We are roughly 100 people strong. Over the year, we range from about 85 people on the payroll in February to 125 in the summer. We're roughly a $10 million a year budget operation, of which half comes from the earnings on the endowment from Mrs. Cary's legacy at the Mary Flagler Cary Trust, and the other half from largely from the ability of our scientists to get research grants from the federal government. And then there's a small segment from private philanthropy and fundraising, which needs to grow. But it is, it's in the genesis stages right now. That's the best way to put it. We, as I said, we focus on three main areas: Hudson River and water, disease ecology, and environmental chemistry, which is a broad category that takes in acid rain and changes in the chemistry of the atmosphere that lead to climate change. Josh may want to reconfigure those, but right now they're kind of the guiding principle of things. We maintain a lot of our property as with public trails, public openings. Mike Fargione back there in the back corner has joined us in January as the director and manager of those lands, both for research and for public outreach. I already feel like Mike and I have sort of a shared vision of what's important about maintaining a landscape for wildlife and for human enjoyment of wildlife. So, you know, I hope a lot of those things don't change. You know, if they do change, I hope they evolve with the times of what is most useful and appropriate to fit into this community and the Hudson Valley and the ecology of the planet, which is changing so much about us. So, I'm going to stop there. That's probably enough.
Any
I'll be
questions?
glad to take
Any
some
questions?
questions. Some of you, and I can be totally honest, because I'm gonna be gone in 6 weeks, so you can ask me things that, you know, a couple of years ago, I would have given you a line. But tonight, you'll probably get the straight truth. Sorry.
I have a question. How fast and to what extent do you see the impact of rising sea level on New York City? And what can they do about it?
Okay, so, sea level, New York City, I think the scientific consensus, the vast majority of those that work on sea level rise are looking at 18 inches to 2 feet playing out in the next 50 years, globally. So sea level will rise differentially in different places. And I'll go into in just a second why that is. But that's a global average. So that, you know, that doesn't sound so bad. I mean, maybe if you own a shoreline restaurant, the sea level rise of that much would seem alarming. But it will really play itself out during those storm surges. And, you know, if you get a hurricane at a high tide, a full moon associated with a high tide, and wave action, you know, we saw that with Katrina. Essentially, Katrina was a combination of the worst set of circumstances. That is largely going to be driven by melting of Greenland and land, ice that's on land today. As the next century plays out, it will be increasingly joined by melting in Antarctica, which, so.
What can they do?
What can they do? Well, okay, so this is the problem with global warming, is, you know, what can New York do? All that New York can do on a short-term basis is do what the Dutch have done for years, is to build seawalls and levees and deal with it. If you really want to address this problem, and this is where it gets difficult, we've got to get our society off of burning fuel that's based on carbon, coal, oil, and natural gas, that puts carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and warms the atmosphere and melts the ice.
Is it too late for that?
We have lost a lot of valuable time in that process. I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to avoid the worst part of global warming playing out. On the other hand, every day that somebody in a job like mine goes to work, you've got to look in the mirror and say, you know, onward to battle, and do what you can to convince society that this is, it's been, you know, wonderful for our economy, but it's not so great for our future, and for the future of kids, and for the future of agriculture and health of humans. So, you know, what can you do in response? You can spend a lot of money building seawalls and moving crops around and the like. But the essence of the problem, if you don't want to just cure the symptoms, you want to cure the disease, it really means getting us off of a carbon-based energy society. And that's tough. But, you know, I haven't given up on the idea that it should be done. Yes, sir.
I don't so much have a question as a comment. I think we are all exceptionally blessed to have your institute as a neighbor. The members of your institute participate very broadly in our community. You run into them at village meetings, town meetings. Although your organization has a global and national reach, you do a great deal of good in the county. Your group, Dr. Husfeld and others, has done wonderful work in helping us deal with a very challenging problem of tick-borne diseases. Others in your organization have done a lot to help us protect water supplies. And so we're very grateful to have you as neighbors, and thank you for all the use you may have to do.
Well, love the comedy, although you embarrassed me a little bit to get all that in public. It's been a lot of fun being. The 7 years that we've been here gone by just like that, which may be part of getting old, but it really is. This has been fun, but it has gone by fast, and it's been fun to institute some of these new things, particularly the outreach programs, and see the town. I mean, we fill I joke with people that our auditorium is the hot ticket on Friday night at Melbourne when we have a program. Best anyway.
Have you worked out how you're going to continue Earthwatch?
I think Earthwatch will take a little hiatus here. I don't know what Josh wants to do. We're going to record it through
I thought you might continue it.
well, I thought about that, but there's several reasons I don't. I don't want to have. Well, let me say, all modesty aside. Well, that's also in the picture. Alan Chartock tells me all the time, Bill, we really like your voice. Doesn't matter what you say. I decided when the search began that I didn't want to be the voice of the Cary Institute in the Hudson Valley with a new guy or woman trying to get started. And they ought to decide whether they want to do it, whether they want me to do it, and then of course I have to decide whether I want to do it. 650 episodes is, I write probably 40% of them. And when I sat down and started doing this, I thought, okay, well, there's an endless number of environmental problems. I've been working on this for 40 years. I'll never run out of things to write about. But 650 of them is a lot of episodes. And, I've run through a lot of my topics. I need a little breather, and the hopper can get refilled by taking a little breather. So we're taking a little breather. And we'll see what happens, come fall, come Labor Day or such. It's actually a lot of fun, and I work with a wonderful producer from the WAMC sends down, who's, we go down in a padded room down in the basement of Cary and record those, and it's just been a lot of fun doing them. Actually, the recording is not, the writing, getting an idea and writing a 2-minute episode on something that's the limiting factor. And if I'm in the zone, I can sit down on a Sunday afternoon and do 6 or 8 of them, which Lori Quillen and my wife, they're just astounded. If I'm not in the zone, I can sit and look at the computer for hours. It's nothing happy. So it's been interesting to pursue that. Other thoughts and comments and questions? I'll give you a shameless plug. Next Friday night, our next Friday night at Cary, Peter Crane, who's the Dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies down in New Haven, will be talking at Cary on ginkgo. He is a world scholar on the history and evolution and movement of ginkgo tree around the world, but also how it's responding to various environmental perturbations. So it's a hot ticket to be there. 7 o'clock, the coffee and cookies are free.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, John, as well. History and science all in one session. Who would have thought it? And, thank you very much for your attendance. We have some refreshments, light refreshments for you. Thank you for, again, attending our evening, and thanks again to John Foreman and Bill Schlesinger for a wonderful program.